So let me introduce Emily. She's a doyen of interactive fiction. She's been influencing and leading the space for many, many, many years. She's currently creative director of Fail Better Games, which makes the game Fallen London, for which she's going to talk about tonight. So without further ado, please, Emily, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I need to apologize in advance. I've had a cold for a few days. It's largely going away at this point, but if I have to stop and mute and cough, I apologize for that. So yes, I'm creative director at Fail Better Games, and that means partly working on some new projects there, but also supervising what happens with Fallen London, which is a browser-based, text-based game that has been running for over 10 years now and has a long and rich history. And I know some people on this in this call have a great deal of experience with it, and some people perhaps not very much experience with it. So I'll give a little bit of sort of explanatory background about what this even is, and sort of beg the patience of the from people who will find this all very familiar. So Fallen London is a setting that is full of stories. We have a space in which Victorian London has been stolen from the surface of the earth and brought underground for a number of reasons which are deep in secret lore. And now all sorts of strange and mysterious things can happen there. There are different kinds of monsters, there are different kinds of powers, and the player's experience of this is being presented with this space, this sort of map that they can delve into and play with. And as they choose a place to interact with, they'll see different stories that are available in that space. And within those stories, a series of choices that are all text-based. So each thing that you can do has very explicit prerequisites and very explicit consequences. And this is all built around what we refer to internally as a storylit structure. And this is a piece of terminology that actually originated within Fail Better, but has now become sort of used in a number of different places in the industry. But what we mean when we talk about this, and I'll come back to kind of what this is and sort of how it applies a bit more later in the talk. But what we mean when we talk about a storylit is a piece of content that has certain requirements to unlock it. It might have some cost in terms of gameplay resources that you have to use up in order to access that content. It might have some skills that you have to be where the player has to be at a certain level with their stats in order to access it. It might have some other prerequisites in terms of narrative history that has to have happened. So you might have things where, a storylit represents a particular point in the storyline and you have to have gone through the previous chunks of story to reach it. And then you have the content itself, which is the text and the options that the player has to play using that particular piece of text. And then you have effects that change the game world going forward. So those might be resources that the player gains. It might be quality changes that represent their progress in the story. It might be additional changes to stats. And at that really high level, this is actually a structural model that many, many games use in different ways. It's very explicit and very visible in Fallen London because the player is actually sort of constantly presented with a menu of storylets tied to their map from which they can pick what they want to do. But there are lots of other games where something similar is going on in terms of storylit structure, in that perhaps you're moving through a 3D space and you're triggering particular narrative events that can happen in a particular location. Perhaps there are other pieces of gameplay that are unlocking that piece of content. But it's a pretty widespread and reusable structure that just happens to be very visible in this particular piece of work. And so what that looks like in Fallen London specifically is having these options that you can choose among anytime you're working on a story or other types of processes that you might be engaged in. So there are some pieces of Fallen London that are quite linear, where the player begins an adventure with another character or an expedition to a distant place, and that's built out in a very kind of standard narrative arc structure. And then there are other elements of the game that are much more about sort of repeatedly doing certain activities that might have different consequences at different times. So you might decide that you wanted to write operas for the court. You might decide that you want to run experiments in your laboratory, and all of those different kinds of pieces are represented by Storylit. So things that in another type of game might be represented by a mini game where you had some sort of separate perhaps graphical representation of a particular activity, all of that is being done in text and represented by Storylits, and the sort of changes that you make to your world result from the effects of the storylets that you're playing and the choices that you're making. So when we look at a screen like this, what we're actually seeing is next to the sort of go button to make a choice or try something, we're actually seeing a little representation of these are the requirements that you have to fulfill in order to access this piece of story. And these pictures at the top of the screen are also sort of card-based options that you have available, where again we can see specific requirements that are required in order to be able to play that piece of story and see what happens. So there's a sort of combination of storylets that are presented in that card format where they might be randomly drawn, and then other storylets that are available to the player all of the time. So we've got these kind of elements of randomness and unexpectedness, and then a certain amount of consistent predictability. And it's up to the player to kind of navigate through all of this environment and decide, what do I want to engage with at the moment? Do I want to pursue this long-running storyline that I'm part of? Do I want to spend some time engaging with an activity? Do I want to do that in order to gain lots of resources because I'm trying to save up for something and unlock something else? Do I want to go over here and look at some new piece of content that was just introduced to the game world? But that leaves a lot of space for the player to direct their own travels through this very narratively dense environment. And this is now a very large game. So it has been added to, as I said, for over a decade. There are millions of words that are part of this. And during the past couple of years, since the beginning of 2020, we've added a very significant amount of new content. So more than a fifth of the game's content at this moment was written within the last 18 months or so. Just a few more sort of examples of what this looks like. The thing I would draw attention to here is, as I sort of implied in a couple of other places, it's a game that really kind of wears its mechanics on its sleeve. You've got things where you have opportunities to make choices and do things, and those choices explicitly say, here are your chances of succeeding at this based on what your current stats are. This is what would be required in order to make it more likely that you would succeed. So a lot of things that other games kind of push to the background or conceal to some degree from the players are just all up front and quite visible here. And then we've got, if we could sort of an overview of what player stats and player inventory look like. We're tracking all kinds of different things, some things that are very similar to what you might expect to find in a lot of RPGs or other types of games. So you've got skills, you've got your character's ability to be watchful, which is a very important skill. It's sort of how much are you noticing and catching on to the world's secrets. And this is a world that's just absolutely full of weird secrets to find out. So that's quite important. You've got your relationships with other characters. You've got alignments with different factions in the game world. Yes, it is an old inventory, sorry. But you've also got things where, sometimes the inventory includes items that are much more abstract or theoretical. So you can have objects that represent secrets or discoveries or knowledge about the world of particular kinds. You can have things that are presented as part of your outfit or presented as a weapon or a hat and kind of conceptualized as though they were usable, wieldable weapons, but that are actually much more theoretical. Like a terrible headache might be a hat that you can wear that will affect your stats. And then we're also tracking visibly all the sort of progression through these stories and where have we gotten to in the big arc stories, which are these ambitions. When you play the game, you can select which of 4 different ambitions you want to engage with. And those are really long-running stories that are designed to kind of take you through a lot of the progression of the early game. So they're kind of tied into making a certain amount of progress, and then you can advance your ambition storyline. And then you need, frequently there are roadblocks that require you to go back and engage with a lot more of the main game before you can move that forward. So they're meant to kind of escort the player through a lot of the content and form kind of a backbone of their experience. And then some very strange possessions. So one of my favorite items in the game is the counterfeit head of John the Baptist. And I love the fact that this is a game world where that is a thing that could exist. And I can't take any credit for that because that was true long before I arrived. So in terms of how is this monetized? How does that work? How is it sustainable? There's a very, very large amount of free content in this game. Access to it is gated by a certain number of actions that you have available per day. But we have a couple of ways of spending money in the game. One is that you can spend money to unlock specific small storylines. So this image of Upwards is a piece of poster art for some of the paid content that we have in the game, where if you've played a certain amount and you want to explore a particular part of the story even further, you can spend some in-game currency in order to access that piece of content. It's almost like kind of we're selling you a little additional story out of this huge anthology world. You can get access to that as well. And then we also have a subscription option, which allows players to have a slightly more sort of generously structured action meter, and it's a little bit detailed, so I'm not going to go into the weeds about how that works, but a little bit more sort of freedom about how they're spending their actions per day. And then also subscribers get access to a monthly story that is a linear storyline that might take sort of 45 minutes to an hour to kind of play through if you're going through it. And so those kinds of pieces are what keeps the game alive, as well as some sort of seasonal festivals where players can choose to engage with and get in-game objects there. So that's kind of how the money structure works on that. So things that were sort of the interesting challenges about this at the beginning of 2020, and I sort of picked this timeline for two reasons. One, because this is the point where I joined the company. I started working for Failbetter the beginning of January 2020, and I had done a lot of work with them previously, but as a freelancer. So that was something where I would write particular storylines, or I would contribute to either Fallen London or to some of their other projects. So Sunless Sea and Sunless Skies are other games, premium games that are set in the same universe that use some of the same tool sets and have some of the same sort of storylit structure. And I had worked on all of those different projects, so I was sort of familiar with both the lore and also all of the sort of these narrative design structure elements as a result of that. But I hadn't really been in a position where I was sort of thinking about, okay, well, what is the narrative trajectory of this? Like, what are we doing with it kind of long term from here? And then the other sort of reason to kind of look at the game from this point is that this is our 10-year anniversary, and we decided as a company to make a push to finish some content that had been waiting for a long time. So I mentioned earlier we had these ambition storylines that were really important to players, but actually they were unfinished at the beginning of 2020. So you could get a certain distance into them and sort of reach this, in each case of these 4 stories, this big cliffhanger moment. And that was it. And then the game had just kind of left it there for quite a while. So there were a number of players who were very eager to find out, what happens after this. And then also just we wanted to kind of expand and develop a number of elements, based on ideas that we had after having gone away and come back for a while. So that brought with it a number of challenges, because we had a game that some people have been playing continuously for a very long time. Like, we had some committed players who had genuinely been playing this game since 2009, 2010. And who had accrued basically everything that there was to get in the game, even with the kind of action meters, and you can only play a certain amount of this game per day. If you play it every day for 10 years, you get a lot of stuff. And so we had some players who were just like had these huge stockpiles of everything imaginable. And then we also had some other players who hadn't been engaged with it for that long, but we didn't want to leave them out of anything that we were adding to the story at this point. We wanted to make these sort of new pieces of the experience feel like it was also, those pieces were also for these newer players. On top of that, we also had a number of players who had played these one-time stories that came with being a subscriber. And at this point, the sort of exceptional friends subscription, being able to play these one-time stories, had been going for a number of years. So there are a lot of those stories also that somebody could have played. So there's a lot of sort of lore that's set in this world that only a section of the player base has access to or knows about. And other players are completely free players and are not sort of don't have any access to those elements. And we didn't want to leave them out of things as well. And then there was sort of this memory issue of, if we're going to do interesting callbacks to things that were in the past, like for some players, that was a really, really long time ago. And for other players, they had played these, the first part of their ambition sort of a few months earlier. So there were all these sort of challenges around not having the player base all in the same place when we're creating new content for them, needing to figure out, how do we remind everybody of where they are? How do we signal what it is that we're trying to do now? How do we make people who made important decisions in the past feel like those have some continuing impact on what they're doing in this game world, but like if they also sort of maybe forgot about that, it's not the end of the world? How do we make things that happened in some of those exceptional friends stories and subscription stories feel like they're tied back into the new content that we're creating, kind of like reintegrated with it to a degree, but not so much that people who aren't subscribers feel left out? And then on top of all of that, we knew that there were some things where we wanted to innovate on the game design itself a bit. And that involved a certain amount of experimentation. But in its very earliest stages, Fallen London had not had some of the sort of tool affordances that it does now. So in the very early stories, it was harder for us to track progress from one place to another. It was harder for us to build interesting sort of mechanical interactions where something complicated happens over a number of different storylets. And that meant that some of the early game, both because of the design and because it was built back at a time when there just wasn't as much of the game, like some of the early game was quite grindy and very slow to move through, and had people sort of, working through re-encountering the same stories and the same content a lot before they were able to build up their stats enough to move forward in the game. And we wanted to kind of speed that up and also just make the structures that we were using more interesting for people. And that is very much a kind of an ongoing process. So what I'm going to talk about here is sort of some different approaches that we took to doing that. I'm going to say up front, and I I would have said this up front even if I didn't have people in the audience who are longtime players who know this and would call me on it anyway. I will say up front, not everything we have done has like worked flawlessly. There have been experiments that have, some have paid off well and some have been a little bit more shaky. And we've also learned a lot about our player base and what they want and what works for them in this process as well. So I'm going to talk about kind of all of those things. So one of the things that we sort of started thinking about from the outset is like, why are our players with us? Like, what do they want from this game? This is a very unusual game. People who have stuck with it for a long time, or even people who have sort of come to it newly but have really gotten enthusiastically engaged with it, they're looking for something quite specific. This is not a sort of AAA mass market game where we're trying to be everything to sort of everybody. It's, we need to understand why the people who like this particular game are engaging with it. So that's something that we sort of thought about and looked at. And we kind of developed a sort of set of ways of thinking about what people are looking for around sort of different categories of player engagement. I should sort of further caveat this by saying, I'm sharing a few of these categories for the purposes of this talk. We actually have a somewhat more sort of complicated and detailed in-house model. It's a little into the weeds for a talk like this. So this is a kind of like a higher level up from that, but sort of in sort of broad categories. So some people are really interested in the role-playing aspects of this game. They're interested in creating a detailed idea of who their particular character is and how they're engaging in this world, what it might be like to inhabit this world. There are often people who will think about, like, I'm going to engage with this particular piece of this game world, and I'm going to play perhaps the same Storylit activities over and over again in order to like maximize my statistics that say that I have painted hundreds of paintings and my character is a master painter and that is a key part of who they are, and I'm going to achieve that in the game world, and then I'm going to put that stat in my profile in a way so that other players who are looking at my character description will know that that is who and what I am. And it's like I want to sort of create all of these sort of this characterization, and also, in some cases create fan art, create fan fiction. We internally, we don't read people's fan fiction because there are sort of legal challenges around that, but it makes me happy to know that it exists. I'm glad that people find this world so engaging and the stories so engaging that they want to connect with it in that really kind of deep and creative way. So that's lovely that that's the case. And then also, in some cases, players invest in such a way that they kind of say, I want to adopt a particular way of behaving in this game that's actually kind of a bit restrictive, but is going to shape my gameplay experience even further. So we have some characters who really try to avoid any elements of the game that are criminal activities or things that are fraudulent or things that are drug use or all sorts of things. And not all of them are, not everything that people avoid are necessarily what you might think of as like illegal things. It's people have sort of different ideas about which pieces of this feel so out of character that for my character, I'm really going to try to avoid those. So it's really kind of an interesting set of ways of approaching that world. Another really important one is people who are coming to this game to see themselves reflected in certain ways. And I think this is particularly resonant because Fallen London is one of the first games out there, certainly one of the first games that many of our own players encountered, where at the beginning, when you're defining your character and you're asked about your gender, you can say, like, I'm a gentleman, I'm a lady, or you can choose not to answer that question. And there's a lovely piece of sort of funny in-game text about how, people walking the streets of Fallen London have squid-like faces, like, why are you asking me about my gender? It doesn't matter. And for a number of our players, that was a really important moment that they were allowed to define themselves as perhaps not like non-binary or not belonging to those categories or just wanting to reject the question. And that aspect of the game has grown in a couple of ways, but especially around sort of issues of self-identity and self-identification. And there are a lot of players who, over the sort of intervening years from the time that characterization choice was introduced, let us know about other ways in which they really wanted the game to reflect aspects of their lives, especially aspects of their lives that they did not see reflected in other games. So when we were coming in at the beginning of 2020, we had some players who had said, I like that there are a bunch of different options about what spouse I could have, but I would really like it if there were a meaningful way for my character to be aromantic or asexual or poly. I would like to, have these different options and feel like the game acknowledged that my lifestyle is valid and real and is a thing that exists. And so that's something that we take quite seriously and think about a lot. It's not, it's not the only thing that we're doing, but it's a sort of element to what we're trying to build that affects our thinking quite a bit. Another sort of key thing is people who play the game in order to talk to each other about it. When I started playing the game myself, I was part of a friend group where a number of us were playing and would just talk about what was going on in the game all the time. There are ways to send people sort of limited messages within the gameplay. And there are lots of different ways that you can kind of engage with this. So it might be through social actions that are actually located within Fallen London as a game, but it might also be talking about the game on our Discord server, which is where I know a number of people at the beginning of this chat mentioned hearing about this. So that kind of like, I'm not just playing the story, I'm playing the story with people, and that's an important part of what we're doing. The hoarding and collecting instincts is another huge one. And there are lots of different things that you could want to collect in the Fallen London world. So you might want to build up a lot of achievements. You might want to get lots of different kinds of inventory items. There are some people who are kind of specialist collectors and try and get like every kind of companion animal in the game that you possibly could get, and then post screenshots of their amazing animal collections to our subreddit or things like that. And then there are other people where their sort of collector instinct is more around collecting a maximum of the actual story content and the text, and they want to see as much of the text as they possibly can. And it's interesting because that instinct, and I'll come back to this from the design perspective a little bit more in a minute, but that instinct actually means that people who are coming at it from the I want to collect all the text perspective have quite different play patterns from people who are playing it from that role play perspective of I want to embody a particular characterization, and they tend to approach things differently and want different things out of their experience. And then there are players who are really interested in kind of just maximizing, like, how quickly can I get in-game resources? How rapidly can I achieve, purchasing like the most expensive high-end inventory items? Can I work out like what the ideal optimum way is to get through a particular activity in the game? There are definitely people who really kind of like, I think, almost enjoy spreadsheeting the game like as its own kind of hobby activity, almost separate from actually kind of interacting with the game interface, and kind of sharing that information with each other and thinking through how all of those systems work. So that is, again, kind of a different way of approaching this material, and it's one where that kind of maximizing wish is interested in what are we doing with our mechanical complexity, what have we changed that might introduce friction to their experience, and so on. And then the last one that we have to include here is that there are some storylines in this game which are intentionally destructive of the character, and they're clearly signposted that is what they are. But it's sort of like, if you follow this particular path, it is going to reduce your stats, is going to cost a lot of resources, is not going to be worth it from a gameplay perspective at all. It's going to be a different kind of experience from that. But for some players, that's a really kind of interesting and intriguing thing to have. And that's another kind of category of engagement with the story that we need to bear in mind. So sort of as we're starting to think through, like, what are all of the pieces that we need to build into this game, and how are all of these bits going to get together, we sort of consciously kept an eye out on, are we building things that speak to these various aspects, these various sort of interests of different people? As I said, there are a few more that we have categories for that are a little bit more complicated, but are we addressing all of these? And as we kind of create experimental new material, like, who does this work for? Who does it not work for? Are there categories of player who like this, and then other categories of player don't like it? Like, how does that work? So sort of thinking about, like, given that whole context of, we want to make the gameplay richer, we want to make it less repetitive and less grinding, but we want to give ourselves a lot of space in which we can tell some new stories. We want to kind of give the game this new jolt of vitality, because it has been quite a while that it has been under development. How do we approach that, and how do we, in particular, and so this is where the sort of narrative design piece of this comes in, like, what sorts of narrative design choices do we want to be making in order to support the long-term growth and health of the game, in a context where we know from experience, like, our monetization model only supports generating a certain amount of content per month or per sprint and so on. Like, there's only so much that we can build. So we need to make decisions about how we're structuring all of that is going to get kind of the most out of that time that we have available to put into the game. And at the same time, like, hopefully make that like a richer experience, and make sure that more of those different needs are sort of served simultaneously by our content. So one of the things that I was really interested in at the beginning was, how do we build some more sort of mechanical gameplay loops. So things like the cases where I'm going to a laboratory and I'm running an experiment, and there are certain storylets that I do every time I run an experiment, but the experiments themselves might be different. Or I'm going to set out on a journey, and that journey is going to have certain steps, and it's going to take me a certain amount of time to get to the end of it, but that journey can work in different ways. Like, how do we build structures like that mechanically out of pieces of story that are kind of interesting to engage with, and they have the mechanical complexity that they can be satisfying for the collectors and the maximizers, right? Like, there's something that you can engage with in this content where you can tune up your performance, you can improve your stats, and you can get better results from it. And then you can see the results of having those better stats lots of other places when you're playing through the game. But at the same time, like, how do we keep that plugged into the linear stories that we want to tell, and that are often, for some of the other categories of player, like often the most important thing in the game to them. And also just, like this game as a whole really needs those kind of narrative arcs. So one area that was, sort of successful in some respects, unsuccessful in other respects, and then to some degree kind of like a victim of its own design goals, was the laboratory experiment wheel. So I've sort of referenced this a couple of times already, but one of the things that we allow the player to do when they got into fairly high stat level is have their own laboratory in the university. So they've gone through various other stages where they might have done sort of smaller things in the university, but they get to a certain point where they can have their own laboratory, they can start their own experiments, they can train students to help with their experiments. Some of the sort of examples that I showed earlier are actually showing examples of these branches. So you can have characters that are working with you in your laboratory who are then going to be able to help advance whatever experiment you're doing, and playing the storylets that engage with these people advance your mechanical stats as to how well your research is going. But you also get a piece of text associated with them that says, what did they think about what you're working on? What was their interpretation of what's going on? And the idea underlying that was, we want a wheel, which is sort of our internal term for these kinds of repeatable, mechanically moderately complicated activity pieces of the game. But we want that wheel to be something where we can actually do meaningful amounts of exposition via the wheel. We want it to be something where a player could start an experiment, and the experiment project might actually be part of a longer storyline that's about something else. So you might have a linear story that was part of an exceptional friend story, or or you might have something that was embedded in one of sort of the longer narrative arcs, where there's a point in the story where it says, okay, you need to go like figure out how to do this next thing by running a lab experiment. You go to your lab, there's now a storylet available to you to start an experiment about that particular thing that's going to be relevant to the linear story that you're currently in. A lot of the storylets and the mechanics still share all of the features that they had under other circumstances, but some of the text is swapped out. So you get text that is specific to what you're doing currently. And sometimes the like other aspects of the mechanics, like you might get some extra storylets that are specifically just for running that experiment to make it feel a little bit richer. And the idea here is we wanted something that was going to let us help pace our major stories, give us a chance to include something that kind of feels almost like a montage sequence in a longer story or in a movie, where you've got like other high pressure things going on, but you really want to let the story kind of take a little bit of a breather. You want to let the player sort of find out some interesting facts about the world on their own time. Maybe even have a little element of exploration, because you can hire different experts to work in your laboratory and find out different information. And those experts have different things to say about different experiments. So there's kind of that exploration aspect of thinking, I bet this particular expert would have something interesting to say about this story. And so there's that kind of initiative on the player's part. And it's also giving us something where that allowed us to tie back into a number of those other elements that when I was talking about sort of stories that players coming into this might or might not have played already, or they might or might not remember, one of the things about the lab is that the different experts that you can bring in to work with you in the lab, many of them are characters who have some existence elsewhere in the game. In some cases, they're characters that you could actually have met in one of those subscriber-only stories. Sometimes they're characters that encounter you earlier in the game, and so you already have some kind of relationship with them. But that kind of gives the player an opportunity to mix and match of like, okay, I remember this character and I really want to spend more time with them, and so I'm going to bring them into my lab and keep them around. This particular character, I feel like my character is connected to them strongly. And we also have, this is a way of sort of creating long-running consequences to those ambition storylines, because when you finish your ambition story, as we made possible in 2020, one of the things that happens at the end of the ambition is that somebody that you met during that story becomes available to you as a long-term companion in your lab. And it's a way of, even as the game goes on and on and on, and maybe, the player perhaps gets further and further from the time that they finished playing their ambition, they still have this, not just souvenir. It's not just that there's this character or this relationship that's in their inventory or changing their stats, but they have a kind of live relationship with that character that persists as a pointer back to the story that they experienced with that person. So as I said, there were a couple of things that were challenging about this we did not deal with perfectly. One of them was simply that when we brought the lab out, there were some design choices where we made about just sort of basics of the gameplay of like how you would access some of the card elements in the stories that were kind of non-ideal, and we knew were non-ideal at the time, but we figured we were kind of like, okay, we'll experiment with this, we'll see how people feel about it, and we'll adjust it quite soon. And one of the things that happened, which was an interesting kind of challenge, is from the sort of narrative team narrative design perspective, was that lots and lots of other stories, like after we created this construct in the game, lots and lots of the other stories that we were building very rapidly started making their own lab experiments. So there were lots and lots of lab experiments very quickly, because this mechanism was serving a really useful purpose from the sort of game design perspective. Like if we wanted to have something where we could dole out this information, like here we now had this sort of nice way of doing that. And it was the new shiny thing. And so that meant that the lab grew kind of new content in a way that kind of outpaced like our initial intentions about how we were going to refine it before we built it out. And that's something where we we've only just now addressed some of the sort of design issues that arose as a result of that. But I think the sort of takeaway from that for sort of other long-running projects might be, when like if you have something that is particularly in a live context, sometimes when you solve a particular design challenge, that it can actually introduce some unexpected growing pains just from having like created this solution that suddenly like various people on the team are just really eager to make use of that quickly. And so it can kind of balloon. So something to kind of think about. So that kind of leads into something I've alluded to already, is sort of the broader challenge of like dealing with consequences in a really long game anyway, right? Like lots and lots of projects that we do are finite length games, and if they're sort of not completely finite length, there are things where it's like, okay, there's a main game and then there's some DLC, and those are all like clearly constructed packages of content. You know where it begins and ends, and you know how long you expect the player to be spending on experiencing that narrative arc. And that allows you to kind of like expect like, okay, when the player gets to the end of the game, these other things that could have happened to them, like maximally would have been 80 hours of gameplay earlier or whatever, which is still a long time, but there's a reasonable expectation that like they basically even probably remember most of the stuff that happened previously in the game to some degree. And that on top of that, you're not incurring this need to just keep telling the player's story on and on and on for a long time after those consequences have been created. So when you have this kind of like essentially, boundless live game ongoing over a really long period of time. It introduces these challenges around how do we tell stories where we've got some meaningful thing that happens at the end, like the player maybe we really want them to be able to make choices that feel important to them, that have some sort of long-term effect on their gameplay, they're memorable, they're rich. And at the same time, it's like, well, but a decade later, how much of that have they retained? And is that one, if we give them sort of one amazing choice moment for, to rack their brains over, maybe that does really challenge them to decide about for a few minutes, but then, that's still not a very long portion of their overall gameplay. So the sort of question of like, how do we deal with all of that becomes quite an issue. And it's not something that typically tends to really be addressed at all in most narrative design conversations that I see. A lot of narrative design conversations, we talk about sort of branch and bottleneck structures or other kinds of designs that are, sort of imagining that finite kind of game shape. And that doesn't, like, that kind of branch and rejoin doesn't really work the same way in this particular kind of context. So, one thing that you can do, obviously, is, give people choices and then basically throw away the answer that they gave you. And sometimes that's legit. I mean, I don't want to, like, I don't want to be too precious about it. Like, there are times when you can get a really interesting short-term experience by doing that, and then the player is okay with you moving on from that, especially if within the sort of broader world that you're telling the story in, that is a relatively small choice. Like, you can do that sometimes. But the sort of like, let's give them good and juicy consequences, at the same time, we can't afford to do something where, we've massively branched this story and now we have to build, sort of variant futures, like completely variant futures for the players forever after. And often the players, in fact, don't even want that, right? Like, one of the things that a lot of players value about their Fallen London experience is being able to talk about it with other players and having shared components to it and not being locked out of chunks of other content. So this speaks to both the sort of the socializing motive and the kind of collector motive of, if you kind of go down one fork and that precludes you experiencing major other narrative arcs, like, that can be frustrating for a segment of the player base as well. And it's just low return on investment from a crass business perspective, which we have to occasionally consider, even though it's not the thing that we're most excited about. If you give players one choice and then loads and loads of consequence writing as a result, like, that is a very, very expensive way to build content. So, dealing with that is a thing of thinking about, like, how do we do modular consequences where the outcomes of different choices the player has made come back to you repeatedly in different ways, but also in a way where those consequences can plug together successfully. So some of that is about the kind of the design of what's at stake in the story in the first place, and having kind of orthogonal consequences. And what I mean by that is, like, different areas where the player can have an influence that are just, like, not essentially related to one another at all, where you could have a yes or no on either side, and any combination of these is possible. It's not going to screw anything up. We've got a story where Alice can fall in love or not, and she can win a Pulitzer or not. Like, those things can happen completely independent of each other, and we can do callbacks to either or both of those things, and it's not producing sort of a massive combinatorial explosion to have those possibilities in the gameplay space, because we can have storylets that hook into, one or the other or both of those things as we need to, but we're not really sort of committed to honoring all the variant possibilities in every single thing that we might ever write about Alice ever again. At a more granular level, we do a lot with text replacement. So this is something where, towards the beginning of the game, I mentioned that the tools for Fallen London and the underlying platform has evolved a great deal since the beginning of the project. And one of the things that we have is the ability to kind of swap in text depending on lots of other sort of specific information about what the player has done so far. So basically any of those qualities that you saw in their inventory, which might be things that they possess, it might be places that they are in the story, it might be all sorts of things. Those can all be the basis for swapping out lines of story, lines of dialogue between characters, and that allows us to do lots of embedded callbacks. That itself is something that we have to be slightly careful about, because I know it drives the lovely editors of our wiki to a certain amount of distraction when we do too much of this, because then they want to document everything and we've given them too much to document. So that's itself yet another sort of interesting challenge about it. But when we're kind of writing scenes where we've got just one or two lines of dialogue that might call back to, has this player played an exceptional friend's story as a result of their subscription, or have they made a particular choice in the past? Those moments, which don't really sort of throw the rest of the narrative arc offline, nonetheless, like really make it feel like the story is much more adjusting to who that player specifically is without locking them out of anything. And then also, just giving the player options in particular storylets based on what they've done in the past that are still contributing to the story that they're part of. So it's all about kind of like creating these small and affordable callbacks to things that have happened in the past, but that allow you to sort of plug those references into other stories that you're telling. So I'm telling you the story of what happened to your character after your ambition was done, but I can reference, the sort of details of which ambition you chose and how that ambition ended, and that's going to maybe give you a different path through one particular piece of this story, and that allows like those past choices to feel like they have these kind of ongoing ripple effects throughout the rest of the game. One of the other sort of techniques that sort of modularization allows us to do is the idea of having outcome states from past stories that are going to affect lots of different things, but where the player can actually, with some effort, move back and forth between those outcome states. So if you pick sides in a particular context, or you made a particular decision about, how to treat a character in a particular case, that might leave your version of the game world in a particular state that's going to affect lots of things that happen thereafter. But we can set that up in such a way that maybe like by making a significant effort through a bunch of gameplay, you can actually sort of swap the outcome state to the other outcome state. So sort of say like, okay, you picked to be on the side of the rubbery men, but if you do a lot of different things, you can switch your allegiance to instead be on the side of the Bohemians, and now you're going to have a bunch of different things that result from that. That has kind of pros and cons from the sort of like the feedback that we get from players around that. So on the one hand, it allows people who are really invested in getting the mechanically optimal outcomes from stories to feel like they've got the freedom. Like if they picked something mechanically, they did not like how that worked out for them in a mechanical sense, they can swap to the other side, and now that's all fine, and they can use whatever advantages they have from the world state having shifted to that other state. And similarly, people who really are eager to see all of the content and they're kind of taking that collection approach to content, again, like they can swap back and forth between as many factions as they want and see all of the stories that are associated with all those different factions and feel like, okay, I really like, I got the content. This is all like all of this story. I've seen all the sides of it. That feels good. It's something that we find is like actively frustrating for some of the more role-playing focused players, because some of the feedback that we've gotten around that is that sometimes those players feel like those choices were rendered meaningless by how easy it was to take them back. Like even if it requires a very substantial investment of gameplay time to switch the outcome of a major storyline, nonetheless, it sort of feels like nothing is permanent, it doesn't really matter. So now that moment is a little tarnished for them. So this is kind of an interesting one in that I think in some cases it's a very useful technique to be able to use, and it's definitely something to sort of think about for future cases, but it's also one to kind of apply very carefully from a narrative perspective. Like, what are you implying about this storyline? If the game world, you're describing a narrative world in which these outcomes can be freely interchanged with each other, like, what are you saying about that world and how much the choices in it matter, and like what does that do for your story? And then kind of the final thing I mentioned, that sometimes, one of the sort of other sort of things that we were thinking about was, if you're playing a really, really long game and the sort of important choice moments are just contained atomically within a single storylet, that as a percentage of your total gameplay is not actually very much, right? Like, you've got that one moment and then it's over, and you spend the rest of your time, like, hypothetically looking back to that moment. And so that's where we started to look at choice, the sort of structure of the choice itself. So how is a choice framed? How are you making the decision? How are you expressing the decision to the game world? So one thing we experimented with here, I'm not going to give context on this, but people who are longtime hardcore players will probably know what I'm talking about. One of the things that we did here was actually, like, insert a real-time delay. Have something where there's a dilemma set up in the game world, and then there's a period of time when you cannot actually register what your decision is about that dilemma. So you just have this period of time to kind of think it over before you can express your choice to the game world. And in one case, we did this where we actually had date lock, not only for individual characters, but for the entire game world. Like, no player in the game was allowed to make their final choice on a particular decision until a particular sort of aligned date, so that all of the players who gotten to that story point were in a position where they could kind of, like, mull over what they were going to do and talk about it and sort of theorize about what was going to happen as a result of that. So I will I will skip somewhat past that because it's a bit spoilery for those of you who are active players, if you haven't run into it yet. But that was something that got some really interesting sort of social effects that I think we probably wouldn't have accomplished otherwise. And I think it did achieve a kind of sense of significance around that moment that might have been hard to acquire otherwise. Is definitely a thing that can feel quite gimmicky, and I would not want to do it all the time. I wouldn't want to do it casually, but for something where it was sort of like, this is a really important moment in the narrative, we really want this to land for people, what can we do to kind of let players spend some time thinking about the stakes and what they want to do about it, and really then make their decision as a result. Another thing that's not quite, sort of stretching things out for so long or in such a mechanical way is this sort of mechanism of actually embedding a flashback within a choice itself. So you saw earlier that sometimes we have quite a lot of available choice options in a given storylet. So, I mean, a lot of sort of choice-based games will say you should only have 3 or 4 options available at a given time, and that's a good rule of thumb often, but not always. And having the freedom to have more branches means that we can set up choices where you've got a storylet, it gives you a certain dilemma, it frames the dilemma for you, and then certain branches at the end of the storylet are very clear that that's going to be your decision. It's going to move the story on. If you make that choice, that you're moving forward. But you don't have to make all of the branches or all of the choices in that moment be of that kind. You can also have some that are allowing the player to explore the moment that they're in a little bit more before they make a decision. And one of the sort of versions of this that I thought worked particularly well was actually in that moment of choice, giving the player the option to experience a flashback of how they even got to this moment. So that meant that sort of structurally, this moment in the gameplay was the same for everybody. The story continuity and the structure was shared, but people who had different player build-outs or had different backstories for their character actually had different ways of experiencing their flashback of how they got to that point, and the opportunity to kind of express different attitudes towards it as well. So there are lots of different ways to use that, like asking the player why are you here? What do you want out of this? It's all about sort of inviting them to participate in building the stakes of the choice for themselves. And also kind of curate, like, out of their own past experiences, which of these things really matters to their character. And that's something that role-playing players often express as they particularly welcome. And then finally, kind of the big example of like a really kind of extended choice mechanism is actually making a full-on activity out of the choice itself. So one of the big sort of things that we built in 2020 is this storyline in which you are building a railway out towards the west of London, where in the direction, as we all know, like, is towards hell. And in order to do that, you have to assemble a board of different characters who are weighing in on the decisions that you're making. So this is again using some of the elements that we saw in the lab of having the player being entitled to bring in characters that they care about from the past and kind of re-engage with those characters and those factions. But the way that the board is structured is it's actually kind of exploded the choice mechanic from one moment of gameplay to this whole kind of activity that you do in order to create a sense of both sort of stronger stakes and stronger importance, but also to allow the player to really explore those decisions and learn about how different factions in the game world might react to the choices that you're making. Because at this point, as you're building your railway, you're making decisions that are impacting a lot of people in London and the surrounds, as well as your own character. So there are reasons why other people might be invested in your choices quite significantly. So the way that the mechanic for this works is that you can bring up a question for the board. So you're sort of starting a new process similarly to the way that you might start an experiment in your laboratory. You can bring people into your board or vote them off the board, so you can kind of rotate who you have involved. And then when you want to make a particular decision, you have to go through and successfully persuade each board member to support the decision that you want to make, which means that you're doing this stat check. I showed that back at the very beginning that if you make a particular choice, there's a sort of what are your chances of succeeding or failing at this. So you're making stat checks in terms of like, am I going to persuade each of these people to be on my side? So some characters might be much more difficult to persuade than others. And that gives us an opportunity to like have the characters talk about how they feel about these choices. We get a lot of kind of exposition and characterization rolled in there. And at the same time, like that also allows us to express mechanically those factional connections as well. So if a character has a particular investment in a particular faction and that faction is really opposed to what you're trying to do, like the stats to engage with that character are going to be much more difficult than if you pack your board with people who are largely on your side. But when you've convinced everybody, then you can conclude your vote. There are some sort of additional nuances to this, but essentially, this also means that you get a combination of things I find really useful in a narrative context. Like you've got a main outcome where the player knows where they're going, they know what they're trying to achieve. There's that sense of agency of I'm trying to do this thing, I'm going to spend this time like convincing my board, and then like once I've done that, we will have achieved the thing that I was trying to convince them to do. There's some partially predictable costs and side effects. Like you probably have an idea of which of your board members are going to be on your side, or if you don't know that already, you will quickly see that when you encounter them. But there are also elements that are unpredictable out of that. You don't know exactly how long it's going to take to get through. You don't know exactly what characters are going to say to you about that experience. So that led to lots of sort of fun and interesting sort of emergent things about how players engage with those choices and how they engage with like choosing who is even going to be on their board to talk about it. So there's like lots of sort of fun Reddit conversations about like why people picked the board members they picked and how their board members tended to react to things. And we were able to sort of see from people talking about that different players and different play styles were able to engage with this in a lot of different ways. So, some people from a role-playing perspective were sort of I role play somebody who really cares about these particular factions or is close friends with this particular character, and therefore I'm going to engage them in my board, and I'm going to play the game that way, as I'm, this person is my best buddy, and that's the story I want to tell, and that's why I have this person on my board. And then other people were thinking much more in terms of this character seems well aligned with my players' long-term goals, so it's probably like they're likely to agree with me on a majority of checks. Or more tactically, like there are certain weaknesses and strengths of characters on your board that you could exploit or not. So that's something where there were sort of potential tactical advantages you can get out of having particular clusters of characters on your board. And then there are just some people who are like, I don't care that it means that my board meeting is really long. I am going to collect all the text, and therefore I'm going to have all the characters on my board. I'm going to have like a 20-person board meeting. It's going to take forever, but I'm going to see absolutely everything that everybody has to say about anything. And those are all completely legitimate ways of playing this, which the players could kind of choose for themselves what they wanted to do with that. So those kind of major choices in the railway storyline incorporate a lot of these different elements. They take time. They're demonstrating stakes and consequence, like embedded into the choice mechanic itself. You're getting the opportunity to really hear about, like, why does this matter? What does it mean? We're getting costs, and we're getting kind of emergent mini stories, because there are lots of things where like people would decide, I'm going to vote this way, but this one character really doesn't agree with me, so first I'm going to vote them off my board, and then I'm going to make this choice, and then I'll bring them back on the board. There are all these sort of things like that that came naturally out of the mechanic, that were sort of cool little elements that players had as part of their stories that we hadn't authored per se, but that we had intended to be part of the possible experience. So I'm running low on time, and I should stop and let people ask questions in a minute, but I just wanted to kind of take this back to sort of broader narrative design terminology for a moment before we end it. A lot of the stuff that I've just talked about, like framing the stakes, the consequences, they're all elements of the sort of choice anatomy, and sort of how do we conceive of the choices that we're putting in front of a player. And if these sort of terms are unfamiliar, like there's lots of cool writing out there. One of the things that I find particularly useful, it's an academic paper, but nonetheless, I think really interesting, by Peter Mewhorter, that I can share a link for at the end of the talk, where it really kind of breaks down like what elements come into play in helping the player understand what decision they're even making, and what that's likely to mean to them. So, if we sort of think about, like, you've got that, sort of that basic anatomy of a choice of we've got setup, options, and outcomes. How do, if we sort of think about like expanding that out to describe the anatomy of something more like that railway board choice, you've got some framing, but then you also have options embedded in that moment that are revealing more stakes, letting you explore more, and then letting you make a final commitment, and then you get your consequence, whatever that consequence is going to be. So I will stop there, and I think that's the last slide there, and just sort of pause on that in case anybody wants any of those URLs. And can take some questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was amazing. Really interesting. I'm sure a lot of people got a lot out of that. I certainly did. If you want to either use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and I can unmute you to ask a question, or if you want to paste some questions into chat, then I'll read them out for you. In the meantime, one question I had while I was watching the talk was, how do you QA like this volume of immense amount of content?
I mean, it's a mix. So it's a mix, and it's also something where our tools are getting steadily better. And one of the things that I've really, it may be less sort of player visible than some of the other things that we've done, but one of the things that I've really been interested in since being here has been kind of thinking about, like, how can we enhance what the tools are able to do for us on that front, and that's still a work in progress. But we, for new pieces of content that are coming out, obviously we have an editorial pass that looks at sort of text and flow and a lot of elements like that. and a QA pass of sort of actually playing through things. And I'm conscious that Olivia is on this call, who until a couple of months ago did a great deal of this herself. So there's sort of that, like, in the short term, how do we deal with this? We also have some debugging tools that allow us to basically sort of swap out the characteristics of whatever testing persona we're using. So as you might imagine, like, some of these elements play quite differently depending on whether you have high or low stats, or you have particular background qualities or whatever. So we can kind of create different personae for ourselves and play through in different contexts. There's also some there's some things that we are doing with sort of both analysis of the data itself and having more in the tool that will automatically catch certain kinds of errors. So there are a number of things where if you, for instance, require a player to have a quality, which there is no way in the game for them to acquire that quality, which sounds like something that nobody would ever do, but absolutely actually is a thing that people do. You get sort of the tool will give you a little warning. And I mean, I've picked that example because it's relatively easy to explain, but there are sort of things like that where the tool itself is able to alert you to certain kinds of things, or even if it's not giving you a warning, in some cases allows you to just view, like, if you're using something as a requirement and it is available elsewhere in the game, you can pop up a little window that tells you where is this thing available elsewhere in the game world. And so as a sort of reviewer, like either as an author or a QA reviewer of the content, you can see, oh, actually, like, this item is only available in this one very obscure place, so maybe we should not make that a requirement, stuff like that. And then we also have been doing more sort of concerted betas, and it's, we have a really deeply lovely player base, and people who are sometimes willing to do limited betas with us as well.
That's great. Thank you. Jamie, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Emily. That was fantastic. I'm a long-time fan, so mine is probably a bit too fanny. What sort of organization system do you use for organizing characters, plots, locations, etc.? Is this organized in engine, via a database, specifically when it comes to collaboration? Thank you.
So there are a couple of different things that we do. One is, just at the back end, the tool lets you you can look at stories and storylits in the tool, but you can also look at individual qualities in the tool. And this is something that, like, it sounds incredibly obvious in a way if you're used to working on Fallen London, but there actually are a lot of storylit systems that are not tooled in such a way that you can look at the qualities themselves. But within our tool, you can look at things like, I want to see dangerous in all the storylits that ever require it or use it in any way. I want to see those stories in order. So, if we've got, for instance, a quality that tracks how you're moving through your ambition, and I want to remind myself of how the ambition is structured, I could go into the tool, I could select the quality that tracks progress through the ambition, and I could request it to show me an organized list of all of the quality or all of the storylits that contribute to moving that ambition forward. And it's like getting an outline for a story, which is super helpful. And then there are also some elements that we keep, as you might expect, outside the tool. So we have, for instance, lore documents that talk about, what do we know about all these characters? What have we revealed? What have we not revealed? What are we planning to reveal in the future? Things that we are planning to reveal, sometimes we change our minds about. That's the lovely thing about the future. But that allows us to kind of communicate with each other about what we're expecting, and also even to jot down. So one of the things that's sort of an interesting challenge is that often there's a requirement that we reuse. Like, we have a piece of seasonal content, festival content, where we want to reference back to characters who were introduced sometime earlier, but it's actually not the same writer who's putting together the festival versus whoever might have written that story originally. So we're trying to also be a little bit more forward-looking by when the writer is writing an original story for the first time, introduce a new character that they think might be a good candidate to revisit at a future seasonal event, or to reuse in an interesting way, to just make a document saying like, this is one of our possible candidates for a future seasonal event, and here's who the character is, and this is the storylet where they appear first, and so if you want to kind of look them up, and here's how I think it might be useful to develop them further, and so that kind of gives future writers a little bit of help.
Nightmare, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Let's see, I've got it written down here. Yes. So how do you handle the challenges of distributing lore throughout a non-linear narrative?
It's it is definitely challenging, and it's especially challenging with something as huge as this. And there are some things where we try to sort of associate certain kinds of knowledge with progress in particular qualities. And one of the things, and this gets very inside baseball, but one of the motivators behind bringing in some of the new skills that we brought in 2020. So there was a suite of new advanced skills and abilities that we introduced for players in 2020. And they all have to do with really quite arcane things that you might be able to do in the world of Fallen London, many of which are things that don't like meaningfully exist as skills in the real world. And part of the intention with that was that we could be, that kind of allowed us to connect certain beats of lore around those things with the beginning of those skill progressions. And so we could be reasonably confident that a player who was advanced in those skills would have encountered certain ideas at the very least. So, there's a little of kind of that kind of thinking, but it's definitely true that we can't really absolutely control in what order people encounter things. And as the game has grown, as there's more and more content and it's more and more possible to access it in a totally different order from the order in which it was written or kind of designed to be accessed, that it's possible to kind of, encounter some deep secret and then, a few days later play a storylet in which everybody seems to not be aware of this fact about the world. So, it's a bit of a juggling act, but to the extent that we're able to, a lot of it is around this kind of deciding which lore we really care about gating like that, and then seeing where we can tie that to qualities.
Thank you.
Jacob asked via chat, that slide about blocking players piqued my interest. You seem to have a lot of respect for the player base and cultivate trust. How do you balance that and challenging / blocking players / keeping Fallen London a game and not a unit of content to consume?
Yeah, I think that's particularly interesting as a question because some of our players, we definitely have a spectrum of players, some of whom really want to engage with it in a game-like way, as I was talking about those different player groups, and some I have the impression would be okay with it being mainly story with just a bit of memory of what big decisions they've made. So it's something where, it's not even like there's one correct solution that is going to make everybody happy. I think one of the big things for me, and I readily acknowledge that we don't always do this perfectly, but an ambition, at least of mine, is where we make things take time for the player, try to make sure that that isn't actually an interesting experience or an experience that aligns with what they want to be doing. I think from a sort of creative direction point of view, one of the things that I was interested in the beginning was trying to make a lot of things just not feel so grindy, right? I don't want you to have to repeat the same storyline over and over and over again in order to make any progress. Because my sort of feeling was that's not actually delivering a particularly satisfying experience, and people might want to have a more interesting set of thoughts about how they're balancing these choices. And one of the things that we learned from doing some of the more complex and richly structured activities was that Yes, there's some people who are very enthusiastic about sort of seeing more depth and complexity there. And then there are other people who actually really like having a game where they can spend a few minutes a day doing something that they don't really have to think about that much, but that makes them feel like they've progressed. And so that was something where, it's kind of had to factor that back into, the sort of accessibility of the game for those players. And basically, so in practice, what this tends to mean is trying as much as possible to design structures that accommodate multiple ways for a player to engage with that content. So this gets back to like what I was talking about with the board meeting of like different players who want different things out of that experience can approach it in different ways. And it's not always possible to do that with everything, but that kind of design strategy of like, if you've got something where there's an easy, very accessible way to do this, and then there's a really like complicated, arcane, slightly more efficient way of doing it, your accessibility desiring players will go do it the simple way, and maybe be a little grumbly that it's less efficient, but they still will prefer that. And then your total maximizers will work out the special plan and go execute it and like enjoy doing that. So yeah, providing those options as much as we can is really the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. That was genuinely wonderful, Emily. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, I'm gonna drop that answer about Peter's article before I forget into the chat, because I saw somebody had asked about it. But then we're good to go.
In the meantime, I'll remind everyone that Brum Indies meets every Wednesday on our Discord, which I linked to in the chat. We watch a GDC talk and then we chat about it afterwards. And then once a month, we have these live speakers. And the best place to be to hear about those live speakers first is in the Discord. You can also follow us on Twitter at Brum Indies. And we have recordings of this talk, and we'll edit it and put that up on our YouTube as soon as that's available. And you can find that again. We'll post about that on Discord and on Twitter when that's available. So all that remains for me to say is, again, thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for turning up, making it an extremely successful night. If this was the kind of live social event, you'd be getting a big round of applause now, I'm sure. You have to just put up with just my clapping.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It was really a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. See you all next time.